my name is Cassandra, and today we are going to be making some bannock or fried bread. The ingredients you're going to use are pretty simple. We're just going to use some baking powder, a little bit of yeast, some flour, and some water. We're going to need a big bowl to do all the mixing in. I use a fork to do all the stirring. You can use a measuring cup. A lot of people say they don't use any measurements when they cook bannock, and I don't really use a whole lot of measurements, but we'll try and give you some slight measurements today. And then we'll just need some tongs and some lard or oil to cook it up in. You could also cook the same recipe in the oven and it's going to work, but today we're just going to be doing some fry bread, which is quicker. Okay. So to start with, I've washed my hands really good because we're going to be mixing with our hands at the end. We want to make sure we're not touching ourselves or touching a lot of things, so we want to get everything ready beforehand. Wash our hands, have our whole station washed and ready to go so that we can just dig in. Okay, so this is 2 cups, so I'm just going to make 2 cups worth of 2 cups of flour worth of bannock. So what I'm going to do is just take 2 cups of flour, put it in my bowl. Then I'm going to take my baking powder, and this is what I mean when I say people don't really measure. All we're going to do is take a regular sized teaspoon, and we're just going to take a big scoop of it. So it's heaping there, you can see, and we're just going to toss that into the flour. I use a little bit of yeast. You don't have to with the same recipe. If you don't have yeast, it's fine, but at this point I would put in 2 scoops of baking powder. So I'd double up on the baking powder, but for this recipe, because we're going to use a tiny bit of yeast, I just use 1 thing of baking powder, 1 scoop. And then, yeah, if you don't have any yeast, you can use a little bit more baking powder, and then at the point where we let the dough sit for a bit before we fry it, I'll just let it sit a little bit more to have some more time to rise and some air to get in there. So, yeah, this is just my recipe. Okay, so I'm just going to mix the flour and the baking powder. Make sure it's nice and mixed up there. What I'm going to do after that, because we're going to mix in the water and yeast together, but the flour mixture, I'm just going to make a little bit of a bowl shape. So I'm putting my flour and stuff on the outside of the bowl to make a crevice, and that's where I'm going to pour my water into once I get to that step. Okay, so I'm making a bit of a bowl there. And then we're going to get some water. Now the temperature of the water is pretty important. It's lukewarm, so I always just turn on the warm water, obviously let it sit for a bit, and just like a baby's bottle, I use my wrist to judge the temperature. If it's a little bit too hot for that, because of sensitive skin, it's too hot, but you want it warmer, just about the same temperature you wash your hands with. With the yeast, we're going to take a small scoop, so the same spoon, just a small regular teaspoon, and it's not heaping or anything. You can see it's almost pretty level, just a full spoon. And then we'll put that in there, and then we're going to mix in our warm water. Now we have 2 cups of flour. We're going to use 1 cup of water. So this is about the ingredients, the quantity of the ingredients I use. So if I'm making more bannock, if I'm making, say, using 6 cups of flour, making a large thing of bannock, I'll use a couple scoops of baking powder, and then, you know, like say if I were making a big batch of bannock, I would probably use a pretty heaping spoon of yeast. You don't have to use a whole lot of yeast even if you're making a larger quantity, so don't go overboard on the yeast for sure. You're going to use a little bit, and if don't multiply it for the size for each the size of a larger batch. Just add a little bit more. So we're gonna add some water to this, and we're gonna add a cup. Okay. And then I'm just gonna whisk the yeast into the water. Mix it. This is kind of the important part about it. You just gotta slowly mix in the flour. So what I do is I have this little, I can't tip it obviously, but I have the liquid in the bowl inside the bowl of flour. And what I'm gonna do is slowly, I just work in circular motions. I'm just gonna slowly mix in the flour on the sides. So I've just heard that the mixing, how you mix is important because like you're mixing in air to it, so that's why you want to do it slowly. You want to get some air into there, and that's going to help make it fluffy. I guess if you mix fast, they say you'll get some hard bannock, so we don't want that. We just want to go nice and slow. And eventually we're going to get to a point where we have to start using our hands because it's going to get too thick. Alright, so now we're going to start using our hands, and we've already washed them really good, and we've washed our table here, so we're actually going to take a little bit of flour and we're just going to spread it onto the table so nothing sticks. And then we're going to start using our hands, but once it gets a little bit thicker, we're going to pour it onto the table and then we're going to knead it. So it's still quite liquidy. We're just going to mix it around with our hands in there. There. And just gonna keep flipping and kneading, putting some air into that dough. You can see this is quite a small batch we're gonna make, but it should still make about 8 to 10 pieces of bread, of fried bread. This is a nice consistency that we have right here. You can see it's not sticky anymore. There's parts, if you pull it apart, that are still sticky in there. But we don't want to add too much flour. We want it to still have a bit of that stickiness. So this is probably good right here. And what we're going to do is we're just going to leave it and let it sit for about 10 minutes, and that'll help it rise a bit. So we're just going to leave it on the table there. And then while we do that, we're going to take our lard and we're going to put it in a pan, and we're just going to put it on about, I'd say about 6 to 7. If your oven goes to 10. It's about 6 to 7, so a little bit between medium to medium high. And it also depends on your oven, so if you have a really hot oven, obviously turn it down, but once we start cooking, we'll show you about how hot it is, and you'll be able to see once you put the bannock in if it's too hot or if it's not hot enough. Okay, so we're just going to wait 10 minutes and we'll put our lard on and get it heated up too, and by the time that's warmed up, we should be able to start cooking our bannock. we have our dough and it has been sitting for about 10 to 15 minutes. With the yeast, it's not super important that it has to rise a whole lot because once it hits the heat, that yeast is just going to expand anyways. But if you are just using baking powder, if that's all you have, with this step, you want to make sure that it sits, otherwise your dough is going to have a hard time rising once it hits the heat as well. So we're just going to test our lard right now. We had put half a pound of lard in there. It's all melted, it's nice and heated up, we can feel it. We're just going to see if it's hot enough to actually fry the bannock. So I'll show you what I mean when I say hot enough. So we're just going to take a little pinch to see. And we're just going to stick it in the bannock. And it's bubbling. That's good. That means it's hot enough, but it's not bubbling way too much. If it were too hot, it would just continuously keep going, and it would just keep frying. It's still bubbling a little bit on the sides, as you can see, but it kind of dissipates as it sits there a bit. And you can also see already it's been sitting there for 15-20 seconds. It's already starting to brown a bit, and you can see that our dough is also expanding. So that's good. I think we're at a pretty good temperature. We're somewhere between medium and high right now. It might be a tad too high, but it looks all right. We flipped it and it's quite brown. It's been in there for maybe a minute, and that's all it's going to need per side is about a minute per side. I am going to turn it down just slightly. So it was about halfway between medium and high. I'm going to turn it down to about halfway between that and medium. Just because it did get quite brown quite fast. So we're just going to cook the rest of it. I'm going to take pieces of my dough, and I take about a handful. I'm just going to flatten it out. And I always just put a little hole in the middle just to give some air so it kind of evenly cooks. You don't have to, but you might end up with a bit of a baseball. It might just poof up in the middle. This way I just find that it kind of puffs up evenly. So I'll just make a little hole. It's about the size of my palm. I'm just going to put it in there. Same thing. I'm just going to keep taking them, flatten them out, put a little hole. I just want to make sure that it feels like it's about even. And it's about a centimeter thick, maybe a little bit thinner than that. And it's going to puff up to at least 2 centimeters or so. So this piece, it might have been a bit too hot because it's quite brown and it's only been on for a little bit, maybe about 2 minutes, a little bit more. And then this first piece we put in, it's ready to flip. You can see it's nice and golden brown. Flip that piece, and we're just going to keep cooking. We need a little bit of oil because once we have a couple pieces in, the oil rises, and we only need to have the oil really cover the bottom half of the dough. While we're taking pieces out, part of it you can see that there's little air bubbles in it, and that's a good sign. It's a good sign that we're actually got some air into the dough, and that once it hits it, it's going to rise really well. So you don't want to flatten it out when we're kind of pulling it apart. We want to make sure it's still fluffy, so we're not trying to squish it down as right before we put it into the heat there. So this piece is ready. It's been in about a minute each side, maybe a little bit more. See how it's nice and golden brown, and it should be ready to cook. So some people put a little bit of salt on there before they eat it, or you can just eat away. Now this is a fairly simple recipe, but when you're making it, you can put in salt and sugar in the process, in that dry process, when we have the baking powder and the flour. Some people put in a little bit of sugar, it'll make it sweeter, obviously. Put in a little bit of salt, make it saltier. I know people who use milk instead of water. Obviously it's going to make it a little creamier. I've never used milk, but I know people who do. So there's a lot of different variations that you can see. This is the important part, is really the baking powder and the kneading of the dough. Okay, and we are all done. So obviously the best indication if your bannock is good is the color. It's going to be nice and golden brown, like that, and nice and fluffy. Okay, thank you.